And yet, I think one of the things that mark us as we grow up into adulthood is that we naturally begin to sort of map out in our mind, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, the way we expect or hope or would like for our lives to go, right? So you grow up and you kind of go out into the world and you pay attention to what's going on around you, and you're noticing, this family, that family, my family, what they do and what they do, and you start to kind of chart a course for how you hope your life will go, right? And a lot of that will depend on your own situation and the situation of people around you. But we have these sort of dreams, we might say, even if they look differently, or expectations as we kind of grow up and mature into adults. And then inevitably, at some point, some of you have been there, some of you might be there now, and some of you are probably going to find yourselves there at some point. Life will not go the way you expect it to go. It's just not how life works, right? And in fact, it may not just be a minor alteration, but it may feel like everything's been turned upside down, like the ground's been pulled out from underneath your feet, where you are disoriented and you are left wondering, like, what in the world has happened that my life ended up the way it did? What in the world's going on? I think it's for good reason that the story of Joseph within the book of Genesis is one of the most beloved stories in the Bible. Honestly, the story is amazing. It's full of all kinds. It's got drama. It's got attempted murder, sibling rivalry. It's a rags to riches story. It's full of suspense and dramatic irony and all sorts of other things that make for good stories today. And Moses, as he tells it, he's like a literary genius. He's weaving it together and pulling in threads from other parts of Genesis and parts that are going to come. And it's just a beautiful and amazing story. But more than that, I think the story of Joseph has resonated so deeply with the church throughout the generations is because of the way it draws us up into the mystery of God's providence. The mystery of what God is up to in the world, especially when things feel like they've gone sideways. Especially when things are not going the way we want them to go. When it feels like your life is in a tailspin and you don't know how you got there or how to get out, and you begin to wonder what God is doing in all of that in that moment. And the story of Joseph can look you in the eye in the midst of that tailspin, and it says to you that there is more going on than what you can see with your eyes. There's more going on there. This is a story that invites us to consider the God who works all things according to the counsel of his will, as we read in the book of Ephesians chapter 1. Now, this is also a story that really only makes sense in light of the larger story that is the whole book of Genesis and ultimately the whole story of Scripture. So we kind of come to find its meaning when we understand what God is doing through the book of Genesis. And because we've been out of this for a little while, I just want to take a quick second to kind of recap where we've been so that we're not reading this story out of context. So remember with me, church, that Genesis begins with the triune God of love, Father, Son, Spirit, who creates the world out of an overflow of love. And what he creates is good. We see this in Genesis 1. It's good. Every day of creation, God says it's good, it's ordered, and it's beautiful. And the capstone of that creation is humanity, created in the image of God, to have dominion and to rule over the good world that God has made as God's kind of vice regents underneath his rule, and yet really working and having authority over the world. Right? We see that in Genesis 1, and we see this in Genesis chapter 2. And yet, that kind of idyllic picture of humanity dwelling with God and working with God in his good creation only lasts 2 chapters. In Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve rebel in sin, plunging this good world into the darkness of sin and death. And yet in the midst of that chaos, God makes a promise. And the promise that God makes is he says that there will come a day when the seed or the offspring of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. You remember that? It's just God's way of saying there's a day coming when a descendant of Eve will deal a decisive blow to the serpent who plunged humanity into the ruin and the darkness of sin and death that we know of our world today. That's Genesis 3 says there's a day coming when God will restore blessing to the whole world. And so in Genesis chapter 12, we see kind of the early stages of God's plan to make all things new. And it happens when God calls a man named Abram and he makes him a promise. And Abram, at the time, he's just a ordinary, run-of-the-mill, idol-worshiping pagan. He's just doing his own thing. He's worshiping idols. And God shows up and says, Abram, if you will leave your country, leave your kindred, leave your father's house, and go into a land that I will show you, I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And through you, here's the promise, I will bless all the families of the earth. This is Genesis' way of saying that God is going to bring this blessing to the world through the person of Abraham. And so from Genesis 12 on, Genesis begins to narrow in on Abraham's family. Abraham, we see his life and his failures and God's blessing of him, and then Isaac and Ishmael, and then Jacob and Esau. And so as we wrapped up our last section, we were following Jacob as he was making his way out from the deceptive kind of care of his uncle Laban and running away from him, and as he's meeting his brother Esau and being reconciled to him, and then now he's back in the promised land, and Genesis 37 zeroes in on one of Jacob's 12 sons, and his name is Joseph, and the story of Joseph begins. And so this is where we're going to be today, in Genesis chapter 37. And as we make our way through this text, we're going to take it in two sections. First, in verses 1 to 11, we meet the dreamer. And then in verses 12 to 26, we are going to see how those dreams are dashed by his brothers. So Genesis 37, 1 to 11, and then 12 to 26. Let's pick up the story and walk through, and then we'll come back and explore what this means for us as the church. It says this, Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph, he brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now, the story picks up when Joseph the text says he's 17 years old. You guys remember what you were doing when you were 17? I was thinking back at this week, maybe some of you in this room are approaching 17 or just over 17, but a lot of us, maybe that was many years ago. I was thinking I was probably in the middle towards the end of my high school career, and I don't want to speak for you, but as I look back, I think I was probably not doing anything that was useful or helpful, probably quite immature at the age of 17, probably more full of confidence than actual competence, right? So this is the age that Joseph is when this story begins to take place. And as would have been the custom, he was pasturing the flock with his brothers. So he's out working in the family business as they did. This great flock that his father Jacob had sort of walked away. Remember the story how God blessed him with the breeding of the sheep and the goats. And he comes away from Laban with this massive flock. And so he's out there with the brothers of the servants of Jacob's two wives, who also had kids through Jacob. So he's with his brothers in the field with the sheep. And it says that Joseph, listen to this language, he brought a bad report about his brothers to his father. So, he's there with his brothers, he's watching, and he goes back to his father and basically says that Joseph tells on them or something like that. That's kind of the idea that's being painted there. Now, kids tell on each other all the time, right? In fact, my most regular alarm clock these days is being woken up by one of my children telling on the other children. That's just often how we wake up. It's an awesome way to start the day. But Joseph is not a child anymore. He's 17, right? And you add to that the fact that when you read in the next line, it says that Jacob, his father, loved Joseph more than any of the other brothers. You start to get a little bit of a picture of who Joseph was in his youth. At best, this is the portrait of the kid who knows he's the favorite, knows he's loved, can't do anything wrong, and sort of uses that position of favor to rat on and tattle on his brothers. I'm sure a lot of us can remember people we knew in our childhood who were like that. Maybe you're here and you're like, that was me. And if that was you, we're glad you're here, and the grace of Jesus is good, okay? But this is Joseph, right? That's the best case scenario. Now, at worst, in the Hebrew phrase that says he brought a bad report, it's a little bit unclear as to whether he's telling his father something true that they did that was bad, or whether he's actually just making this up whether he's bringing like a tale of them that they didn't actually do, and so he's just kind of slandering them to his father in order to further the gap that already existed between the father's love for him and his love for his other brothers. We don't know exactly. Either way, it's not a great opening picture for Joseph. Now notice Jacob's role in this whole scenario. It says that the father loved Jacob more than any of his other brothers. In fact, he loved him so much, it says that he bought Joseph a robe of many colors. Now again, the term translated robe of many colors is a little bit unclear. A lot of scholars will say, I don't know if it actually means robe of many colors. They'll say maybe a better or more literal translation might be like a cloak with long sleeves. Okay, whatever the translation is, it's certainly not a technicolor dream coat. We're kind of familiar with our famous language. But the only other time in the Old Testament that this phrase is used of something worn by one of the daughters of King David. And I think the idea here is that regardless of how many colors there were, Jacob has brought his son Joseph some kind of cloak that was fitting for royalty. Right? It's worn by the son of the king. It's extravagant, and it's something that royalty would wear. So this is like a lavish act of affection from the father to the son. And you can imagine in modern day language, imagine if a father gives the son a crown. It just says, I just want you to wear that around the home and see how your brothers feel about that, right? Like this is the sort of thing that Joseph is doing when he's giving, or Jacob is doing when he's giving Joseph this cloak. And so, you put these things together, and we've got all of the ingredients and more for trouble within this family. A young, tattletaling favorite child whose father is giving him lavish gifts, and jealous brothers, and the end result is described in verse 4. It says, but when they saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. By the way, I think, if we're reading through Genesis, we should notice by now the devastating consequences of favoritism from parents to children. Like this is something we see again and again in the sibling rivalry that often results from that. I know we don't see the parents' favoritism, but this is like Cain and Abel right away. We see this division. You see this with Isaac and Ishmael, this kind of battle between the two brothers, and then especially with Jacob and Esau, where Isaac loved Jacob more than Esau, and there's just all of this family division that comes from when parents they give favoritism to one child over another. But then the picture gets even worse, because it turns out that this young boy, 17-year-old boy, is also a dreamer. Look at what it says in verse 5. It says, now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more, so it's just getting worse. He said to them, you can imagine Joseph in this long-robed or many-colored cloak, befitting of royalty, coming to his brothers. He says to them, hear this dream that I've dreamed. Can imagine they're excited about this. Behold, brothers, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose, and it stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it, and they all bowed down to my sheaf. So you can picture the dream. They're out in the field, and they're gathering the wheat, and they're gathering it in sheaves, and Joseph's sheaf stands upright, and all the sheaves that are identified with his brothers, they bow down to that one sheaf. And the meaning is not lost on his brothers. They instantly pick up on what's being communicated. So they say to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Right? Are you going to reign over us? And then says, so they hate him even more for his dreams and for his words. They're not happy about that. As if that wasn't bad enough, Joseph keeps digging the hole even deeper. He has another dream. Verse 9. Then he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers. And he said, behold, brothers, guess what? It happened again. I have dreamed another dream. And you got to hear this one also. Behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. So instead of the sheaves of wheat now, you've got celestial bodies. Sun, moon, and stars. By the way, how many brothers does Joseph have? He's got 11 brothers, right? And so in the dream, not only are the 11 brothers, but the father and the mother as well are bowing down to Joseph. Now, I don't know what kind of response Joseph is expecting when he tells this to his family, but this is what we read in verse 10. When he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him, So even for the favorite child, he's like, this is a little rich, man. And the father says to him, what is this dream you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? Like just be honest. Imagine your sibling sharing a dream like this to you. I mean, you could picture it in modern terms or something like that. I had a dream that you're going to work for me one day, or something like that, where I'm going to be, in a position of authority, and you are going to be underneath me. Like, how would you feel? Just be honest. If your little brother or your little sister were to share something like that with you. And so, Jacob is just kind of shocked. He's like, what is this? This dream that you've dreamed? Who do you think you are, Joseph? So I think the question we've got to ask as we're reading through the story is, what are we to make of these dreams of Joseph? We could ask the question like this: are these the product of the ego of the favorite child who is so full of himself that he imagines himself to be a ruler one day? It's an option. Or are these dreams that have been given to Joseph by God himself? Because how we answer that question makes a significant difference in how we understand the story and what's going on here, right? And I think as we read through the story, the text gives us only one possible answer. Look at verse 11. Okay, draw your attention to verse 11. Listen to what it says there. It says, and his brothers were jealous of him, as you might expect. They're not happy. But listen to this. But his father kept the saying in mind. You see that little clue that Moses is giving them? So all of them are incredulous. Are you for real? You think you're going to rule over us? For the brothers, it leads to further jealousy. But even as Joseph's father, Jacob, is rebuking him and saying, you're crazy, there's something about it that he's like, he keeps it in the back of his mind. He's kind of like taking this image that Joseph receives in the dream, and he's filing it in the back of his mind for later. It's almost reminiscent of the language we hear of Mary after her encounter with God and the dreams and the angels' visits, where she says, and Mary treasured up all these things in her heart. You remember that? So something about this is making Joseph's father say, this seems crazy, but I'm going to remember this and file this for another time. Maybe there's more to these dreams than I might expect. Later in the story, if you know the story of Joseph well, you'll remember when Joseph is interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. Do you remember that scene? Pharaoh has two dreams, the cows coming up out of the Nile and the grains of corn, and predicting the famine that's going to come. We're going to get there in a few weeks, so I won't share too much about that. But Joseph is called to interpret these two dreams. And he interprets the meaning, and then he says this. Listen to this, what Joseph will say later. He says, and the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. So if we're reading through Genesis and we get to Joseph's story and he's got these dreams, his brother's bowing down, and we're like, it's kind of crazy. I don't know what to make of that. We'll put a pin in that and we'll come back to it later. You keep reading, you hear Joseph's story. He comes to Pharaoh, he's interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, and he says, Pharaoh, the fact that God gave you two dreams means this is from God and it is firmly fixed. He will do it shortly. And then you start to look back and you think, wait a minute, how many dreams did Joseph have? He had two, right? The dream was doubled, the same dream in two different kind of forms or two different images. And so you read through that and then you look back and you start to see what's going on here, right? That God is in seed form giving Joseph some kind of image of the future, something that God is going to accomplish, and he's giving him this dream. You add to that the fact that every other dream in the book of Genesis is either explicitly or implicitly communicated as being from God. It becomes really clear that, despite all of the things that are going on and who Joseph was, these are real dreams that Joseph is receiving from God. God is giving him a picture of what his life is going to look like one day. Now, with that being said, probably, if you receive a dream like that from God, maybe a good idea. Just keep that in your back pocket, Like, you don't need to go and pray that before your brothers. Maybe don't just, draw attention to it. Hey, guys, look at what God's gonna do for me. He's going to raise me up, and all of you guys are going to serve me one day. That's not going to go well for you. And there does seem to be some kind of pomp and pride in the way that he communicates to his brothers. I don't know if you pick that up in the text. But think about the picture that's being painted of Joseph. He's been given royal robes from his father, and he's having royal dreams from God. So if you're Joseph's brothers, kind of putting two and two together, the way he's being treated by his father, these dreams that he's having, you're not happy about it. Right? And like in 11 verses, Moses just does an amazing job. Like, it's just, the story is so well written of just showing the tension and the turmoil and the brokenness that exists within this family. These are God's chosen people. And you can just imagine what it would have been like to live day to day within that context. Favorite child, royal robes, dreams, hatred, animosity, jealousy, envy, all of those sorts of things. And all of this leads us to the second movement of Genesis chapter 37. Let's pick it up in verse 12. It says this: Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, Here I am. So he said to them, Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. That's the task. Go check on your brothers and bring back word about them to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. This is Joseph. And a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, What are you seeking? He said, I'm seeking my brothers. So Joseph goes all the way to Shechem. He gets there. He's just wandering around looking for them. He can't find them. This man stumbles upon him and gives him directions. The man says to him, They have gone away, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Now, I think as readers of this story, we should understand this journey of Joseph's as a journey away from the safety of his father who loves him and of whom he's the favorite child, away from the safety of his father towards the danger of his brothers who hate him. They absolutely despise him, right? And so I don't know, like, if Jacob is just a little clueless and he's just like not picking up on family environment. He's just like, yeah, they love each other. They get along just great. Go check on your brothers. Like, I don't know if he's clueless or what's going on, but he sends Joseph away, and as readers, we should be like, wait a minute. This guy's going into the hands of the people who hate him. And again, we got to remember, this story won't make sense unless we understand that when he says, hey, go check on your brothers in the fields, he's not like going into the back field of a farm as we might know it. Shechem was roughly 30 miles away from Hebron where they were. So that's like a significant several-day journey that Joseph going on. It's not like he can just be like, Dad, these guys don't like me. You got to do something. They're like days away, and he gets to Shechem, and they're not there, and so he's got to go 14 miles further. So I think every step of this journey we're meant to see is a step towards the danger of his brother. Now, at this point, the scene shifts to the perspective of the brothers. Look at verse 18. It says this: They saw him from afar. So they kind of see him coming. Later we'll read he's wearing, which is wild, he's wearing that cloak on this journey, which says something about Joseph, right? Like they're in the field, like doing this hard labor, like with the sheep, probably this rough crew, and this guy rolls in wearing this like extravagant royal robe. Anyways, they see him from afar, and before he came near, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes, notice his language, we will see what becomes of his dreams. So the tension has gotten so strong that as soon as they see their brother, the first thing they think is, here's our chance. Now's our chance to kill him. No one's going to see us. We'll be able to deceive our father and get away with this. We got to act now. And just listen to this language. I just gives such a picture into the human heart. Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams. Reuben, the firstborn, at least tries to preserve the life of Joseph. We don't really know why. You know, it's possible that he's trying to get back into his father's good books, because if you read the end of Genesis 35, you'll see that there Reuben did something awful and horrible. So it's possible this is his way of trying to like get back into his father's good graces by protecting his beloved son. And so he tries to preserve his life by saying, hey, that like guys, let's not kill him. Let's still get rid of them, but there won't be blood on our hands. Let's just throw him in this pit, right? And so that's the idea. The brothers appear to agree. And by the way, a pit is probably like a cistern. They would use these in the wilderness to store things like whether grain or water often. This is why the narrator makes a mention that the pit is empty, so we know that Joseph doesn't drown there. So this is like an empty cistern, and they throw Joseph in there. So he arrives, and he's wearing, again, this extravagant, expensive cloak of many colors. They grab him, strip that cloak off of him, which would have been for them just a painful reminder to them, not only of their father's favoritism, but also of Joseph's dreams of ruling over them, and then they toss him in the cistern. And then wildly, verse 25 says, they do that, they throw him in there. You can imagine how hard this would have been for Joseph, and then they sit down for a meal. Like, imagine throwing your brother into a pit where he will likely die, and then saying, all right, what's for lunch? You know, I think, like, we're seeing just the way they have been desensitized, the way their heart is callous because of their hatred for their brother. Now, Judah, during the meal, it says he looks up and sees. Whenever in the book of Genesis it says, behold, he looks up, it's a key moment. So he looks up in the same way that Abraham looked up and saw a ram when he was about to sacrifice Isaac. He looks up, and behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites. So these are descendants of Ishmael, Isaac's half-brother, coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. This is like an ancient version of like a transport truck carrying goods to another region. These guys are making their way through, and he sees them, and Judah, who, as we'll see next week, is quite opportunistic, has this realization. Brothers, listen, if we kill our brother, we're not going to get anything out of it. It's not going to do anything. Yes, we'll get him out of the way, but it doesn't really benefit. And in fact, he is our brother after all. He's flesh and blood. So maybe we shouldn't take his life. So here's an idea. Why don't we sell him into slavery? That way we get rid of him and we get paid. It's a win-win, right? We accomplish that and more, and we'll get silver from him. And so his brothers think this is a good idea. So the traders come, they pull Joseph out of the pit, and they sell him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and it says they bring him to Egypt. Now, imagine being Joseph. It's fascinating that as soon as the scene shifts to the perspective of the brothers, we don't hear anything from Joseph. He's silent, which I think is a pattern that later writers in the Old Testament and New Testament will pick up, as he's suffering silently as he's thrown in the pit. But imagine the way he's thinking about his life. He just received dreams from God that there will be a day when he is ruling and reigning, and now he goes to his brothers and they throw him into a pit to die. He's literally standing at the edge of his death, and then he's sold into slavery by his brothers. Did he deserve this treatment from them? Like, we might say, well, I mean, yeah, he was a little boastful, a little bit arrogant, but this certainly doesn't seem to fit the crime. Of course, it's not only Joseph who would have been heartbroken, but also his father. Listen to how the story continues. So the brothers, they take that robe, this is key, that expensive, extravagant, royal robe that Joseph was wearing, and they dip it in the blood of a goat, and they bring it back to their father, and this is what they say. They say to him, Father, this is what we have found. Please identify whether it's your son's robe or not. Notice how cold they seem in this whole thing? It's like, hey, we found this. Is this Joseph or not? And so Jacob identifies it, and he says, it is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments, and he put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Did you notice the irony of this whole account? You remember Jacob, his whole life has been marked by deception from day one. He was the one who is grasping, at his brother's heel when they were born, right? And then he deceives Esau out of his birthright through the stew. You remember that scenario? And then he deceives his brother Esau out of the blessing. And how did he deceive his father to steal the blessing? Do you remember what he used? He used the cloak of his brother and the skin of a goat. And here we see Jacob now being deceived by his own children by what? The cloak of his brother and the blood of a goat. This is Genesis' way of just showing us the way that Jacob's own sins will reverberate in his life over and over and over again. But aside from that irony, notice how utterly devastated Jacob is at the news that he's lost his son. You know, if we were to dive into the way this is written in Hebrew, you would just say the way that Moses is trying to show us how broken he is. Imagine your favorite son, and you see his robe that you'd given him as a gift being brought back to you, and you think he's dead. And then it says his sons try to comfort him. Imagine the wickedness of attempting to comfort your father in his grief when you know that the one thing that will actually comfort him, you're withholding from him. These guys know that Joseph is alive, and yet they let their father mourn and grieve and weep for days, all while they know that everything is not as it seems, and yet they're trying to comfort him in his grief when the whole situation is a lie. So the portrait that we get of Joseph's brothers in Genesis 37 is not positive. They're conspiring murderers. Reuben at least attempts to save his life, but he's ineffective. Judah does end up preserving his life, but as far as we can tell, the only reason he cared was because it would make them money. So it's not a kind portrait that Genesis is painting of Joseph's family. But I want us to stop and think about the story as a whole. From the perspective of Joseph, okay, so he receives these dreams from God. And notice that the God isn't actually mentioned in this narrative. But we know, from context that these are dreams that Joseph receives from God. Dreams that communicate to him what his life will look like. Joseph, there will be a day when your brothers will bow down to you. In fact, your father and your mother, they will bow down to you and you will rule. And yet by the end of the story, everything has come off the rails. Absolutely everything about his life. In fact, think about this. He thought he was going to be a king of sorts. He thought he was going to rule, and now he's a slave. You could not get further away from the promise that God had made to him. From a king to a slave. This is where Joseph finds himself kind of literally and metaphorically at the bottom of a pit. It's as low as it gets. I imagine, there are many of us in the room right now that can sort of resonate with that situation, right? Like Joseph, it feels like your life has gone off the rails. Felt like you had plans for what your life was going to look like, and yet something happens, something surprising happens to you, and everything gets spinning out of control, and you don't know how to stop it. Maybe it's a tragedy that your family faced. Maybe it's the surprise failure of your marriage and your relationship with your family is broken. Maybe your health is in jeopardy. You get a call from your doctor, just going for routine tests, you're just checking in, and all of a sudden everything is thrown out of whack. It's possible that your life that was once marked by joy has now been clouded by depression and anxiety, and you feel hopeless. And maybe if you're honest, it's not even that anything horrible has happened to you, but you just feel disoriented with life. Life, it's not nothing major, just hasn't gone the way you thought it would go or how you wanted it to go. And so you live your life and if you're honest, there's no joy there. There's no hope there. Whatever your plan was for your life, this is not it. And when we find ourselves in moments like that, we begin to wonder if God is absent. And if he's not absent, could he ever do anything to redeem or to reconcile a life that has become such a mess? And yet, right at the end of this story, when it feels like Joseph's life and his dreams and God's plan for him have been thrown out the window, Moses, he gives us this little glimmer of hope. And I think it's right here where we begin to see what this passage is teaching us about our great God. Look at what it says in verse 36, right at the end of this chapter. The brothers are lying, the father is weeping and grieving, and it says, "Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Now you might be like, what do you mean a glimmer of hope? He's sold into slavery. How is that a glimmer of hope? But notice that in God's providence, the person that Joseph is sold to is an officer of Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler or king in the region. So it's subtle, but I think like right in verse 36 at the end, I think Moses is just showing us a little bit of the light at the end of the tunnel. We have this dream that Joseph will rule one day. He's thrown into slavery. All those dreams are dashed. And then all of a sudden, Moses is like, by the way, you need to know who he was sold to. He was sold to a captain of the guard, an officer of Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the region. That's what you need to know. Moses is showing us that the plans God had for Joseph, demonstrated in his dreams, will not be thwarted by the actions of his sinful brothers. In fact, I think we could say it even stronger than that this morning. We could say that it's precisely through the actions of Joseph's sinful brothers that are trying to thwart God's plan, that are trying to put an end to the dreaming and the dreamer, that God begins to fulfill his plans for Joseph's life. Isn't that amazing? Like these brothers, they see Joseph approach and they're like, we will see what becomes of his dreams. In other words, we will put an end to those. Like they're trying to stop from happening what God said to Joseph would happen. They're like, no, we don't like that. We're going to put an end to this. We'll kill him, or even better, we're going to sell him into slavery. And yet Moses is saying their best efforts to stop the plan of God from unfolding only end up being the first step in its fulfillment in Joseph's life. Church, think about what this means for us as we think about who God is. That which God has planned, Genesis 37 is saying, will come to fruition, and no one and nothing will stop them. You know, I think it's tempting for us to often to look around at the world, the things that are going on in global events and all these things in our own country. We look around at things that are happening in our lives that feel tumultuous, they feel surprising, they feel shocking, they feel out of the blue, and we look at those things and we tend to think, what is going on here? God, how can you allow this to happen? God, do you see this over here? Like, do you see the way things are going? Like, are your plans going to come to pass? And yet Genesis is saying, God is not surprised by any of those things. He's never caught off guard. God is never frantically trying to get things back on track. Like, oh my goodness, I didn't think he was going to do that. Oh, I bet, plan B, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Like we might. Like in the sovereignty and providence of God, man is making their best attempts to stop God's plans from happening, and he's like, step one in fulfillment. Yeah, that was my goal. He's got to get to Pharaoh somehow. This is the route that I was going to take. Thank you, brothers. And listen, it's not that God's providence renders the actions of humans, that renders them irresponsible. Of course, we are accountable for the things that we do under God, right? And they will be accountable for these things. And we're going to see that come up later. But God's saying they do their things, and in the background, silently, God is at work bringing his plans to pass. Church, do you know, and are you confident in the fact that nothing can thwart the plans of God? Do you know that there's no prime minister that Canada could have that could throw God's plans off track? You know that? Our current one, there's no future prime minister that Canada could have that would throw God's plans off track. Do you know that? There's no global leader that could arise that could throw God's plans off track. Do you know that there is no call that you could receive from your doctor, no diagnosis, no tragedy, no sickness, no trial that can stop God's plans from coming to fruition in your life? That's what Genesis 37 is saying. Now, we need to be really careful here because, there's a way that we can misread the story, right? The temptation would be for us to see this story as some sort of confirmation that despite what my life looks like now, my dreams will come true in the end. I will get what I've always wanted. And I think one of the reasons for that is in our modern day, when we speak of dreams, we speak of dreams that come from within us. They arise from within. These are desires that we have, that we kind of project out into the world. My dream for my life. My dream is this. My dream arising from within. And we are told, chase your dreams at all costs. Don't let anyone stop you. And if you do that, if you kind of ignore everyone else and you go after it hard, you will get it someday. Isn't that the false gospel that we're promised? Genesis 37 is not saying that. The difference is, for Joseph, these are dreams that do not arise from within him, but these are dreams that are given to him by God. They come from the outside. Do you see that? So these are God's plan for Joseph's life. The story of Joseph is not about Joseph accomplishing his dreams in the end, despite what happens, but about God accomplishing his plans for Joseph through unlikely means. So you will not find the Bible promising you that everything will eventually go how you want it to, but it does promise that everything will go, in the end, how God wants it to go. Isn't this what Paul is getting at in Romans chapter 8, verse 28? You know that verse? And I'm sure we'll be back here because, we're going to be looking at this theme again and again over the next number of weeks. Paul says this, "For we know that for those who love God and are called according to His purpose, all things work together for good." Whose purpose? Not mine, not yours, but for those who are called according to God's purposes, all things work together for good, which he just defines later as being conformed to the image of Christ. We'll talk about that later on, right? But the good news, church, is that God's plans and purposes for your life are better than your own. I know that's a hard thing for us to come to terms with when faced with difficulties, isn't it? Isn't that like where the battle is? I have my own ideas of what the proper path would be for my sanctification and my holiness. And things happen, I'm like, no, that's not it, God. That's not the one. You got that one wrong. This is how it's supposed to go. I'll get where you want me to go, but this way. God's like, no. I know better than you do. My infinite wisdom, sovereignty, and providence, this is my plan for your life to get you to where you need to be, right? I don't want to get into this theme too much because, again, we're going to be revisiting this. And so the challenge for me was like saving some for later because there's a lot more to come on this theme. But isn't this the pattern, that we see in the life of Jesus and in the gospel? God's fulfillment of his plans through the sinful actions of men trying to thwart God's plan, right? And in fact, we'll get to this later, but we see in the whole of Joseph's life a pattern or a type being played out that we will see picked up through the life of Jesus. But for now, I just want to focus on the fact that in the same way that God begins to fulfill his plan for Joseph through the acts of his sinful brothers trying to stop those plans, so too we see with Jesus that the moment in which it seems like Jesus' mission, it's dealt its death blow, through his crucifixion at the hands of evil men, that precisely is the moment where God is victorious. Hebrews 2:14-15 says it like this, since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. Isn't that awesome? Destroying death through death. Who would think of that? And yet God in his wisdom sends his only son Jesus, who takes on human flesh. He lives a perfect human life, and all the while we see this opposition. The leaders hate Jesus. They hate the good news of the gospel. And the only response that they can think to put a stop to what God is doing through Jesus is to kill him. And so they think they're successful. They nail him to a Roman cross, and Jesus is crucified and killed, and they're like, we will see what becomes of his dreams. And 3 days later, God raises him from the dead. And it is through his death that he makes atonement for the sins of the world. It's through his death that he delivers all those who put their faith in Jesus from their slavery to the fear of death. That's what Hebrews 2 is saying, right? And if this is the foundation of our salvation, this is how God worked in the gospel to save us and to bring him to himself. Could not our great God use the same means to keep us and to preserve us and to form us and to present us before himself blameless one day? I love the way John Calvin put it when he's speaking about Joseph's situation. He said it like this. He's speaking about his time in prison later, but it applies to this. He says, "Nor did any hope of his liberation remain, especially from the time in which he was neglected by the chief butler, but being condemned to perpetual imprisonment, he was left there to rot. God, however, by such complicated methods, accomplishes what he had purposed. Wherefore, in this history, we have not only a most beautiful example of divine providence, but also 2 other points are added, especially worthy of notice. First, that the Lord performs his work by wonderful and unusual modes." Isn't that true? And we see this as a pattern that God delights to bring about his plans through unusual means, where he's like orchestrating and by his divine will planning out Joseph's life, and he's going to get to this point where he's ruling over his brothers. How's he going to get there? Slavery, by being thrown into a pit. And by unusual and complicated means, as Calvin says, God delights to show his wisdom and his providence. He goes on to say, and secondly, that he brings forth the salvation of his church, not from magnificent splendor, but from death and the grave. The story of Joseph, in many ways, I think, is presented as a story of death and of resurrection. Pay attention to the language. The father is grieving, like Joseph is basically on the edge of death, and later on the story is treated almost like a resurrection from the dead. Church, this is the God we worship, who brings life from the grave, who sends his son, Jesus, in the likeness of flesh, who goes deep into human suffering and death so that he might destroy death for us. This is the God who, in his infinite wisdom, works all things for the good of those who love him. And so this morning, as we stand at the very beginning of the story, church, I want to invite you to consider your story and all the things that are going on, the good and the bad, and what it means and where it's going in light of our great God who works all things. Church, is it possible that even if you can't see it in this moment, that God is doing something wonderful in your life? Is it possible? And maybe you're in your point where you just can't see the end. Maybe you can think of no way, no roadmap to get from A, where you are now, and to B, where you hope God might bring you someday. And I just want to say to you, if that's where you are, the fact that you cannot see a route, it does not mean that there will not be one that God makes in his wisdom and in his providence. Could it be that the trials you face now are shaping you and forming you not only into the kind of man or woman that God will use for his kingdom in this life, but more than that, into the kind of man or woman who will be prepared to see God one day and to dwell with him for all eternity with a resurrected body and a new creation in the new heavens and the new earth? Is it possible that God is doing that? It's my prayer, church, that as this story unfolds for us in Genesis 37, we see God's work in the life of Joseph, that God would just help us to trust him wherever you're at. Maybe that's step one for you today, is to just say, God, I trust you with where I'm at. I don't like what's going on. I can even say to him honestly, I don't like where you've brought me right now, and yet I trust you. Let me pray for us. Father in heaven, we recognize that our finite minds are unable to comprehend the glories of your majesty and your goodness and your power and the ways that you are at work in the world. And so, Father, our prayer now is simply that wherever we find ourselves, whether we are at the bottom of a pit, whether that pit is coming in the future, or whether we've walked through it already, Lord, would you help us to trust you? Help us to trust you for the sake of your name. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.